Welcome back to Module 2 of uh, Religions in America. We're going to start with this module getting a little background to some of Bloom's discussion in the first two kind of meaty chapters of his book. Um, Most of what you will get in this module will come from your own reading, um, and there is a lecture in the middle of it that's not actually me. I feel like it's a good lecture on one of the points. And then I'll close out with a lecture just on some overview of Bloom's actual arguments in his book. For the background parts, I didn't really feel like um, you needed full lectures and readings. I thought it would be better if you kind of got introduced to some of the concepts that he's building on, some of his preconceived notions and predispositions and the biases going in, and his just understandings of things going in, um, as far as in religious criticism and some of the terms that he's using. I just thought it'd be easier if you got that information just from reading, picking up. So I've tried to pull together some good resources for you. Some things, kind of the requisite knowledge. You're not supposed to have prerequisites for this class, so things that you do need to know as you're reading Bloom, or at least will make it easier as you read his book. And one I've already mentioned, we're talking about liberal versus conservative. You're going to have an article on that. Um, Gnosticism and Orphism, what those mean, and also he mentions enthusiasm. I'm not going to give you a lot on that yet. Actually, nothing in this module, except I'll probably mention some things when we get into the final discussion on his chapters. Because I think enthusiasm really gets off point, and that's my argument. We will discuss that later. But because everyone I've ever read that deals with Bloom's argument recognizes the Gnostic and the Orphic part of what he's talking about, I think he's right on there, even if we disagree on some ways that that plays out. So that will be two of the things that you'll be looking at. Um, Also, the idea of criticism, religious and otherwise, what that means, what it means to do criticism, what it means to do religious criticism, and finally, a little bit on the documentary hypothesis. So, right and left, we think a lot in right and left, coming off of the election, hard fought, a lot of hard feelings with this recent presidential election here in the U.S. It's been going back for a few elections now, but this one especially, and even hard fought within the two major parties as to what defines conservative, what defines liberal. We use these terms: liberal, conservative, right, left. Um, but I know it's dangerous, but I don't want you to. It's dangerous to use those terms because of that political baggage. But when we talk about it here, um, it's not primarily political. It has some political fallout, but we're going to be dealing primarily with theological right and left, theological, liberal, and conservative, and what that means. And there's a Washington Post article that you're going to read as part of this module, and you'll have a few questions on that to kind of direct your reading. Because what I want you to think about as you read it is really what differentiates theological right and left, theological liberal and conservative. Um, and that's what the Washington Post article. It's actually looking at the decline in liberal churches, but it does a good job of laying out some of the key points that distinguish what would be called a conservative versus a liberal church here in the U.S. Um, and I don't think it gets too caught up in the broader politics. Um, I want to focus on those theological issues. And one of the reasons is we will get into how these Gnostic trends and Orphic trends play out Um, in some ways similarly, in some ways differently between more right and more left-leaning churches in the United States and religious movements within the United States. Um, so I think there's a shared commonality. It just plays out a little differently based on some of those theological differences. Um, we'll hit those more over time, but that's what this article really is for from the Washington Post that you're going to read on the decline in liberal churches, um, is so that you can begin to see what I mean whenever I talk about liberal and conservative, and also um, Bloom will touch on that as well at certain points during his book. So just to familiarize yourself with what we mean when we talk about that theologically as far as churches go. Also, as I mentioned, we want to talk about Gnosticism and Orphism. Um, and here again, we're talking about tendencies and not religions. Um, it's not that there's a Gnostic church in America or an Orphic church in America. I mean, there might be one out there somewhere. We have so many religions that pop up, people that create religions or claim to find religions or rediscover religions. So I'm not saying there's not one out there, but we're not interested in some kind of literal Gnostic church or Gnostic religion. But we do want to understand the historical meaning of that term, Gnosticism, and the historical religion of Orphism, and what those are, just on a basic level. I'm not expecting you to be an expert, but Bloom, and as you saw with the other article in First Things in the previous module, we return to this idea of Gnosticism, and Orphism will come up more later as well. And you need to know what the root of those terms are. So I'm giving you a few sources, and that's important too. Is I wanted to give you just a quick note on the sources, the things that you're going to be reading, and one thing that you're going to be watching. Um, I've linked a couple of Wikipedia articles, not because this is like high scholarship, but you don't need high scholarship. You don't need the full debate. I just want to introduce you to the concepts, and I skim through these articles. That's what an encyclopedia is for. It's you come across something, you're studying a different aspect, but you need a glimpse of what this term means. And these two articles in Wikipedia seem to be fairly well done. Um, just in passing, I didn't see any problems. And also, there's a video because Gnosticism is the more important one. And I mentioned in the introduction to it, where it's posted in the module, you can watch the whole video. It could be helpful to you. You don't have to watch the entire video. It's not me lecturing. It's somebody else at an actual seminary. But that that video that video is from an evangelical seminary, so it's got somewhat of an evangelical slant. But I chose it because of all the videos I found online. It was really kind of the most basic about Gnosticism, and he focused on the idea of tendencies and not strictly religions. Um, he mentions and assumes one side of a debate going on about Gnosticism and early Christianity, and since that's not really our focus, most of the other things I found online having to do with Gnosticism were really pushing on one side or the other of the was there an early Orthodox Christianity or were there multiple and various types of Christianities early on? That's really not important for this discussion in this class. I just needed to find something that gave you a really solid definition and explanation pretty quickly. Uh, um, I think the full video is like 24 minutes, but you'll only have to watch about 16 or 17 minutes of that to get the sense, and I'll mark out at the introduction to that video what those are. But we want to know more about the tendencies of Gnosticism, and you'll see that in that video, and as you kind of read through the Wikipedia articles, you get a sense of when Bloom uses these terms in his chapters, what that means. All that said, I would read the Washington Post article that I mentioned, um, and this Gnosticism and Orphism article, and watch that lecture before you read Bloom. I'll make that clear in your to-do list as well. Um, Also, the documentary hypothesis, JEPD, you may have heard of if you've had any other classes in um, the Christian or Hebrew scripture tradition. Um, Documentary hypothesis is a prevalent understanding of how we got the current um, embodiment of the Torah or the Pentateuch, what was traditionally called the five books of Moses. Here again, I wanted to find another interesting resource that was also very clearly introductory. And since a lot of journal articles and a lot of writings on this are part of an ongoing debate that you really um, probably don't have much background in, I actually found this article that really lays out just a pretty succinctly, not too lengthy, uh, description of the history of the development of the documentary hypothesis and what that is and what it means, so that when Bloom starts talking about the J author or JEPD or the documentary hypothesis or Wellhausen, you know what he's talking about, know what he's referencing, because he brings that back up throughout the book. But what's so interesting about this resource is that it's actually from a Journal of Mormonism. Um, and if you consider that, not too many years ago, you really wouldn't have found um, that among a serious biblical scholarship within the Mormon tradition. It really has become more mainstream in the last 10 to 20 years, over a course of time, obviously not immediately. And that's something we're going to look at more when we look at Mormonism, but I thought having found this very succinct, concise discussion of the documentary hypothesis in a Mormon journal from a Mormon scholar would give it an interesting um, bent on where your source was from. So I will have one more lecture from me in this module at the end, and that will be going through kind of the core of Bloom's argument, um, and that should be listened to kind of after you read all these others, after you read the Bloom chapters, and answer your discussion questions. So I will look for you at that part at the end of this module, and I hope this is kind of a helpful introduction.